Good evening, everybody, or for our Australian guests, good afternoon. My name is Murray Horton. I'm the organiser of the Anti-AUKUS campaign based here in Christchurch in New Zealand, and we are holding this webinar with two guest speakers from Australia because we felt that it was not widely known among New Zealanders as to what AUKUS is all about and about the very alarming and full extent of Australia's breakneck militarisation, which has taken a further quantum leap in the last 24 hours, according to news reports here. The motivation behind this webinar is effectively, although our two countries are next door neighbours sharing a lot of things in common language, etc., common culture in many respects, there are major differences between the two countries. Certainly in relation to closeness or not with the United States, for example, and that we don't know as much about each other's countries as we should, frankly. So that's the point of holding this webinar, to actually bridge that gap and hear from Australians about what AUKUS is about, because there hasn't been a hell of a lot of coverage in New Zealand, certainly nothing much critical in the mainstream media. And another point I would make before handing it over to the two Aussies is that it's purely coincidental, but the timing of this webinar could not be more propitious, because within the last 2 or 3 days, AUKUS has been all over the news. There's been major developments about it, both in Australia and in New Zealand, and we'll talk about that in the course of the presentation. The program is that we've set aside 60 minutes for 3 speakers, divided 3 ways, so 20 minutes each. The 2 Australian speakers first, and then myself. And then at the conclusion of that 60 minutes, it will be opened up for questions and discussions and comments after 3 speakers have spoken, not after each one and not during. So after the total of 3 speakers, questions, discussions and comments. The 2 speakers that I'm delighted to welcome from Australia, Bevan Ramsden in Sydney, and Shirley Winton in Melbourne. Both Bevan and Shirley leaders at the national level, veteran peace activists in their own right, and are currently leaders at both the state and national level of IPAN. IPAN, the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, is a very active peace movement. I had the pleasure of attending its national conference back in 2017 in Melbourne, when I met both Bevan and Shirley. Australia has, it's fair to say, a much more active peace movement than New Zealand does at the moment. But having said that, Australia faces considerably greater problems in relation to questions of militarisation and war, etc., and intelligence matters than New Zealand does. So, without further ado, I'll call upon, which one of you is going to go first, Bevan or Shirley? Bevan's going to go first. So, okay, we'll turn it over to Bevan Ramsden from IPAN in Sydney. Take it away, please, Bevan.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm from Sydney, as Murray said. I'm speaking from the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose history, culture, elders and leaders I have the utmost respect. I would like to thank Murray for this kind invitation to speak to you today about matters which have serious implications for our 2 countries. I speak as a member of IPAN, the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, which, like the Anti-AUKUS campaign in New Zealand, also campaigns for an end to foreign military bases on our soil and associated foreign spying activities associated with some of those bases. But before speaking about AUKUS and the United States militarisation of Australia, I would like to applaud 2 policies of New Zealand, which we in Australia would like to see our government embrace. And I mean by that, the signing and ratifying of the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which I assume only occurred in New Zealand due to the pressure of the people of New Zealand exerted on its government. In Australia, some 80% of our population want the treaty signed. The Labor Party promised to sign when in government. They are now in government and show no signs of signing it, and have been warned by the United States Embassy that to sign it would endanger security arrangements with the United States. Public pressure is mounting, however, to get that treaty signed. The second New Zealand action, which we peace activists in Australia admire, is the prevention of warships entering your ports if they do not declare whether they are carrying nuclear weapons or not. As the United States refuses to make such a declaration, you keep their warships out of your ports. We need that policy applied to Australian ports to keep out not just foreign warships, but the United States and United Kingdom nuclear submarines also. To understand the current position of Australia on AUKUS, nuclear subs, and US militarisation of our continent, and preparation going on for the next US war, we need to go back a bit in history. I won't go back before World War II, although subservience to imperialism, British imperialism, pervaded foreign policy decisions going back to the start of the colonial invasion of the Australian continent. The Australian government changed from dependence on the UK to dependence on the United States for defence during the Second World War, after the British naval base in Singapore fell to Japanese forces. When World War II ended, the Australian government, together with the New Zealand government, persuaded the United States to form a trilateral alliance called ANZUS, primarily with the idea of providing a defence against a resurgence of Japanese militarism. This ANZUS alliance, unlike the NATO alliance, did not specify that the US would automatically come to the defence of Australia and New Zealand if either country came under attack in the Pacific area, but it only required consultation among the three partners should such an attack occur. However, there is strong belief, perhaps better called self-delusion, that the United States will automatically come to Australia's defence, and that belief or delusion has become a fundamental plank in Australia's defence thinking, in government and by both the Liberal and the Labor parties and in defence circles. The ANZUS Treaty brought with it US military bases. The first was the Pine Gap Satellite Receiving Station in Central Australia, billed as a joint facility. The treaty to establish it was signed on the 9th of December 1966. Edward Snowden described the facility as a giant vacuum cleaner which allows the US to spy on everyone. It is believed that the Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, his questioning of the CIA involvement in Pine Gap helped stimulate US destabilisation of his Labor government, which culminated in its dismissal by the Governor-General using the little-known reserve powers in the Constitution on the 11th of November 1975. We understand that there are 800 staff at Pine Gap, roughly half Australian and half American, with the commander of the facility being an American. Australians are, however, confined to cleaning, cafeteria and ground maintenance duties, while the deciphering room is exclusive to the US. The ANZUS Treaty brought a second base. It was originally named the US Naval Communications Station, Northwest Cape, the distant part of Western Australia. That treaty was signed on the 16th of September 1967. The lease did not allow Australia any degree of control over it or its use, but it did allow Australia to use the very low frequency radio facility to communicate with our underwater submarines. This very low frequency facility is the only sort of radio frequency that will penetrate seawater. The United States used it and uses it to communicate with its nuclear-armed submarines, and could use this radio facility to provide the trigger signal for launching nuclear missiles. According to the governments of the time, Liberal or Labor, ANZUS was used to justify Australia's involvement with the United States in the Vietnam War, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, although in the case of the Vietnam War, it was claimed by its proponents that it was a threat to Australia by communism, which they called the domino theory. One country in Southeast Asia falls to communism and the dominoes go down and finally they'll be at our doorsteps. This was the simplicity of and stupidity of the theory. Concurrent with the establishment of these bases and war involvements, there's been a continual backlash of Australian community opposition. The largest of these being the huge anti-war demonstrations of the 1970s and the huge demonstration against the Iraq War in 2003. Both were effective. The anti-war Vietnam moratorium campaign in the late 60s and early 70s brought a progressive Labor government to power. It cancelled conscription for the war, released those draft resistors in jail that had been imprisoned, and completed the bringing of all Australian troops back to Australia from Vietnam. Whilst the huge anti-Iraqi war demonstrations didn't prevent Australia's involvement in the Iraqi war, it did force Prime Minister Howard to ensure that Australian troops were not put in any position of danger in Iraq, which ensured that no bodies came home in coffins. However, coming closer to the present day, a new stage of US military involvement in Australia occurred in November 2011, when President Obama announced to the Australian Parliament that up to 2,500 US Marines would be stationed in Darwin each year for 6 months to train with the Australian military forces as part of his pivot to Asia strategy. The purpose of this strategy was to confront and contain China, which was being seen as a threat to US hegemony and economic dominance in the East Asia Pacific region. To their shame, all the Australian members of Parliament applauded him for this generous gesture. Of course, this new military development was seen as an appropriate development of the ANZUS alliance for this by the establishment in the defence quarters and Australia's subservient leaders. This new development of a military base and the stationing of US troops in Australia sparked opposition, and it resulted in the establishment of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, IPAN, in 2012, which campaigns for an independent foreign policy, including opposition to all foreign military bases in Australia, including the US Marines in Darwin, and the promotion of peaceful and mutually beneficial relations with all countries. Shirley, in her presentation, will expand on IPAN's formation and activities. One of the outcomes of this US military presence has been regular training exercises in the Northern Territory, or where the largest of these exercises, the Talisman Sabre, occurs annually, with large numbers of US, Australian troops, aircrafts and warships, and it is currently going on at this moment, involves some 30,000 troops, mainly US and Australian, but with smaller contingents from Japan, the Philippines, Malaysia and New Zealand.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
The huge war exercise is a practice under US command for a war with China. Another outcome of Obama's pivot to Asia and stationing of US troops in Australia was the signing in 2014 of the US-Australia Force Posture Agreement, FPA for short. Force posture, their posture in Australia. It legitimises the stationing of US troops in Australia and affords the US places and facilities under their exclusive control for training, storage of munitions, fuel and equipment, spare parts, and as well, unimpeded access to our airfields and our ports. Now, I'm just quoting that. That's unimpeded access to our airfields and ports is the words in the FPA agreement. In short, it's an incredible sellout by our government of our sovereignty, if we still had any. Similar FPAs have been signed with other countries in which US has bases and is stationing personnel. One has been signed with the Philippines recently, and now with Papua New Guinea. So watch out, New Zealand. Under the FPA, huge fuel storage facilities have been built, that's up near Darwin, for US use at East Arm at Darwin, and the runway at Tyndall in Northern Territory, the RAAF runway, has been lengthened at our Australian taxpayers' expense to facilitate US B-52 bombers using the runways and exclusive areas there for parking and maintenance. Up to 6 B-52s are being allowed for at Tyndall. We know that one version of the B-52 can carry nuclear weapons. IPAN has a working group to create public awareness of this pernicious sellout of sovereignty and to initiate a campaign to have the FPA terminated. It can be terminated according to the agreement at 1 year's notice given by the party. The FPA also underpins the proposed porting of US and UK nuclear submarines at HMAS Stirling in Western Australia. This proposed porting is to commence in 2027. The FPA, this Force Posture Agreement, is a prime document facilitating US militarisation of Australia, in which it seeks to base its operations in the Indo-Pacific and from which it could launch or support a war against China. As if that was not enough, the Liberal coalition leader and Australia's Prime Minister announced just 2 years ago, 15th of September, that Australia, the UK and the US were joining together in a trilateral security agreement called AUKUS. Whilst it lacks in written content, its clear intent is a defence pact aimed at China. Its first physical act was the promise to Australia access to nuclear propulsion technology, that of the US and UK, for building or buying nuclear-propelled hunter-killer submarines. These are suitable, particularly for an attack role in distant waters, and no guesses as to where that might be. To the surprise of some, the election of a Labor government under PM Albanese in May last year did not see a repudiation of AUKUS and the acquisition of nuclear-propelled submarines. To the contrary, and dismay of many, Prime Minister Albanese enthusiastically embraced AUKUS and announced that a figure of, and listen to this, a figure of 368 billion of taxpayers' money would be used over a period of several decades to produce this fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. As you might imagine, this has stimulated widespread community outrage, as we have urgent social needs in public housing, rent relief, bringing our hospital and health system up to scratch, and addressing the impact of climate change. And these are being left wanting because of this commitment to such a huge amount of taxpayers' money for nuclear subs. Summing up, Australia's political leadership has always embraced a policy of dependence on a big power for basic defence. With a very brief interval during the Whitlam Labor government, that was 1972-75, when attempts were made to exert a degree of independence. They, that's the Whitlam government, was given a whipping by the United States for this and dismissed from office. That was through using the Governor-General and reserve powers under the Constitution. It was known now that the Governor-General was actually involved with a CIA organisation called the Association for Cultural Freedom. Anyway, the dependence on Britain and the United States has brought with it subservience to the foreign policies of these two imperialist powers, and has provided enthusiastic support for their wars to remind them not to forget us. That's the reason why it's often given, to remind them not to forget us. That's why we go to war with them. This support for the Vietnam War, Afghanistan War and the Iraq War had nothing nothing to do with the defence of the Australian continent. None of those countries posed a military threat to Australia. All three were about the United States pursuing its imperial interests. For example, take the Iraq War. Iraq had nationalised its oil reserves and in doing so blocked Western exploitation of those oil reserves. But following the Iraq War and defeat of Saddam Hussein and his forces, Shell, BP and Chevron are back again in Iraq making money out of the Iraqi oil fields. I remember someone saying it was a war, blood for oil, and very true. The US militarisation preparing for a war against China, probably over Taiwan. China is a challenge to the United States' economic and military dominance in our region, if not elsewhere, and in US eyes, China must be weakened to prevent it challenging US dominance, and they believe a war will do just that. Such a war would be disastrous for Australia. China is our major trading partner. So much of our everyday supplies, including medical supplies and fuel, would be blocked in such a war, and exports to China would cease. Jobs lost and hardship, worse than during the pandemic, would prevail. Even more serious is the possibility of nuclear weapons being used in such a war. Shirley will speak of the growing opposition in Australia to AUKUS, nuclear submarines and the march to war. That movement is growing fast. An opinion poll organisation in Australia, which is somewhat respected, the Lowy Institute, had a recent opinion poll showing that 56% of Australians want Australia to be neutral if such a war breaks out. That is a majority, but the position favouring neutrality and keeping out of such a war is strongest among women, with 73%. Nearly 3/4 of Australian women want neutrality, and 2/3 of young people support this position. A very strong base for the peace movement to work within and help to develop the obvious opposition, which Shirley will go on and explain what is happening. Finally, it's a long talk, this one. If I have a message for you, it is simply this. Watch out for an agreement with the United States, such as the Force Posture Agreement, which gives them a military posture in your country, and oppose it strongly. Keep New Zealand out of AUKUS. Don't allow your troops to train with our ADF and the US military in war exercises such as Talisman Sabre, as they are doing so at the moment, and maintain your strong anti-nuclear stance. We, the people of our two countries, must stop US militarisation of our region, maintain the Pacific nuclear free, free our region of foreign military bases, and promote peaceful and mutually beneficial relations with all countries. Thank you.
Murray, you're on mute, sorry.
I'm not now. Okay, right, you can hear me now, Linda?
Oh, correct.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, Bevan. So without further ado, we'll call upon Shirley Winton, who's in Melbourne. Shirley is also speaking on behalf of IPAN, the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network. Over to you, Shirley.
Thank you, Murray, and thank you, Linda. Thank you for this invitation, and we really are honoured to be asked to speak at your webinar on AUKUS and what it means for the people, not only for the people of Australia, but also for the people and the environment of this region. And I also want to congratulate Murray and others for initiating this webinar, where we can actually learn from each other, where the people of New Zealand or Aotearoa, sorry if I'm not pronouncing it right, and Australia, where the ordinary people can learn from each other and start building a movement in this region. So my name is Shirley Winton, and I'm speaking from Naarm, Melbourne, on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation. I pay my respect to the First Nations elders, past, present and emerging, and the long and rich culture. And I stand in solidarity with the First Nations people in their 240-year-long struggles against colonisation for sovereignty, land rights, self-determination and genuine treaties, none of which have been achieved here in Australia. So I apologise if my talk repeats some information in Bevan's talk, but I just thought it needs to be put into context or put in perspective. Like our friends in Aotearoa and New Zealand, opposition to foreign military bases in Australia goes back over 50 years. And it's no coincidence that Australia is sometimes described as the 51st state of the USA. And it's more relevant now than I think it has ever been before. Bevan has spoken already about the first two US intelligence military bases in Australia, Pine Gap and Northwest Cape, both established in the 1950s. Since then, both bases have been extensively expanded and upgraded. And Pine Gap is now the United States' most important intelligence base outside its own country. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, protests were held outside these and other US military bases in Australia. In 1974, 400 people from across the country held a long march to Northwest Cape. And I think, Mario, were you involved in that? Or?
I was indeed, Shirley, yes.
And in 1984, a women's protest was held outside the Pine Gap, a very lively and loud protest. In 2010, as Bevan said, in 2010, 2011, the US President Obama and US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton visited Australia to announce the new US military strategy and reorientation called the US pivot into Asia Pacific. What it entailed was 60% of US land, sea and air military forces and material equipment would be relocated to Asia Pacific, and it would enmesh Australia even more deeply into the US military. And Bevan explained what the US pivot required, which was the 2,500 US Marines, the upgrading and expanding Australia's naval air force defence facilities and bases to accommodate and embed US military in Australia's defence infrastructure and industries. Australia's defence and foreign policies were tightly locked into the US military machine and also its global policies. Parallel to this was even closer political alignment of Australian governments to US globally and locally. And the first announcement of the pivot was made in Australian Parliament. There was the first international public announcement. Obama was flanked by the fawning Labor Prime Minister Gillard, who gushingly welcomed the US militarisation of Australia. That's a Labor Prime Minister, allowing Australia to become the US base and a launching pad for US wars, giving away our sovereignty. And as Bevan said, the two major parliamentary parties enthusiastically supported the announcement without an open parliamentary debate and a public discussion of the implications of the pivot on Australian people and sovereignty. The immediate community response to the pivot was the gathering in early 2012 of several organisations, there were 8 at the time, with the aim of establishing a broad national network campaigning for an independent and peaceful Australian foreign policy and ending US Marines and bases in Australia. Several academics, retired defence personnel and the retired former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser and community groups were warning that Australia was being turned into a military launching pad and a base for US wars. Over the years, IPAN continued to build a national network of peace, community and faith organisations and unions. National conferences were held in Canberra, Brisbane, Alice Springs, Melbourne, Darwin. As Murray said, he attended the 2017 National Conference in Melbourne. We have more than 70 organisations that are affiliated to IPAN, and then we have a contact list of over 2,000 people. All the while, Australia's military facilities were being upgraded and expanded, some are now unbeknown to the public, and new ones are built to accommodate the increasing US military in the country. Protest rallies also continued. We held them outside Pine Gap during the 2015 IPAN National Conference in Alice Springs. So Australia's deepening integration into the US military and war machine could no longer be hidden. People from different walks of life, including academics and again former Defence and Army personnel, started to publicly question and warn of the dangers of Australia's defence and military merging into the US military and being under its command. The US pivot to Asia Pacific coincided at the same time with US-driven Trans-Pacific Partnership. And our friends in New Zealand are very familiar with the TPP and your wonderful People's Mass Movement opposing it. Trans-Pacific Partnership was the economic side of the US pivot into Asia Pacific to contain China's economic rise and reinforce US economic hegemony. People are probably familiar with US economist Milton Friedman, who said that US investments and corporations around the world are always and always will be protected by the might of the US military. And what we're witnessing now is exactly the words of Milton Friedman. To make Australia a US garrison or the 51st state of the USA, it's necessary to have an uninformed and compliant population, conditioned politically and ideologically to accept Australia's subservience to the US and the propaganda of threats to our national security. Murdoch's media monopolies and a handful of Australia's mainstream media relentlessly push US interests and propaganda. US is embedded in Australia's political, academic, military and media institutions. A number of conservative and reactionary think tanks, which have considerable influence over governments, constantly roll out US propaganda. The Australian Institute of Public Affairs, the United States Centre at Sydney University, Australian Strategic Policy Institute are just some. And the latter, that's the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, is funded by multinational weapons corporations. In September 2021, the Liberal Morrison government announced AUKUS and Australia's acquisition of 8 nuclear submarines. The announcement was framed as a national security imperative to keep peace in the region and unimpeded freedom of navigation, claiming China's military was threatening to block international trade routes in the South China Sea. AUKUS is a US-initiated military pact, a tool to protect US interests in the region. And it is easier to understand AUKUS in the context of US global economic supremacy being challenged by the economic rise of China and the great power rivalries between US, China, Russia and Europe. The US and EU and the military-industrial complex want to maintain their global dominance. Economic competition for resources, markets and spheres of influence is the main driver of AUKUS and of imperialist wars. AUKUS is a product of the US-Australia alliance, with Australia as a subservient and compliant partner, a US deputy sheriff in the region to maintain US control and supremacy in the region, the lapdog of the US. The leadership of the two main parliamentary parties happily embraced the US global supremacy, in spite of it not being in the interest of Australian people and global peace. There's not even an occasional whiff of independence or sovereignty from any of our governments, our politicians. And they're locking the Australian people into the US war machine and enforcing on behalf of the US the so-called US global rules-based order in the region. AUKUS is an instrument for the expansion, solely for the expansion of US military capability and its military-industrial complex. It is now becoming more evident that AUKUS is being shaped into a NATO of Asia Pacific, And New Zealand needs to watch out for that as well. The US pivot to Asia Pacific and now AUKUS are militarising Australia's economy and industrial base as well. Since the early 1990s, globalisation gutted Australia's value-added and manufacturing industries. There's little that Australia manufactures locally these days, but multinational and local mining corporations export our materials and natural resources from the lands of the First Nations people, stolen from the lands of the First Nations people. You often hear people refer to Australia as a quarry, a banana republic. So now the government is telling the people and unions who are concerned about jobs that AUKUS and nuclear submarines will create all these jobs, 20,000 jobs and more, in the new weapons and ammunition manufacturing industry, and most are the multinational weapons corporations. So AUKUS and nuclear submarines have opened the door to the push for nuclear power. Recently, a British politician suggested that Australia would be a perfect place for storing of world's nuclear waste on the lands of the First Nations people. Since the announcement of AUKUS and nuclear submarines, the militarisation of education is also accelerating. Top 10 global weapons manufacturers, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman and others, are now embedded in Australia's universities, directing and funding university research into weapons of mass destruction, war technology, cyberspace war technology, making universities dependent on funding from these warmongers. They are now collaborating with the Defence and Education departments to access secondary and primary schools' curriculum, offering scholarships and prizes for best weapons design. Example, students are being asked to design nuclear-propelled submarines and are offered prizes. AUKUS and nuclear subs are making Australia a target in the event of war between US and China. It's not only the subs that make Australia China's military target, it's the entire AUKUS military pact that's bringing cruise missile ships, B-52 bombers equipped to carry nuclear weapons, huge fuel storage tanks in North Australia, as Bevan has already spoken about, US soldiers and military intelligence, and the upgrading of Pine Gap, Five Eyes, the cyberspace that make Australia a Chinese target in the event of war between US and China. So behind AUKUS military pact is the continuing integration of Australia into this US sphere of influence and locking us economically into the US economic dominance for US interests, not the interests of well-being of the people of Australia and the region. As Bevan said in March this year, the Labor Albanese government announced it would spend $368 billion of public funds over the next 30 years on 8 hunter-killer nuclear power submarines, not designed for defence in Australia, but are designed for wars of aggression, hundreds and thousands of miles away. And the figure will be higher, closer to $500 billion. That's $500 billion taken away from public health, education, welfare, and fixing the urgent climate crisis. And this is at a time of Australian working people experiencing major housing crisis, increasing homelessness, unaffordable rents, underfunded public hospitals, schools, and little protection of the environment. And that's $500 billion on wars of aggression. And the only beneficiaries are the multinational weapons manufacturers who make a killing in super profits from death and destruction of imperialist wars. And AUKUS and nuclear submarines are intensifying the tensions and accelerating the march to war. So the announcement of $368 billion on 8 nuclear-powered submarines sparked public outrage. This was the tangible and concrete consequence and impact that people could see that AUKUS, the impact of AUKUS on the people of Australia and the consequence of the alliance and the problem of going to war with China. It's against this background of escalating US militarisation of Australia and making Australia a vital US military base following the US into another of its wars, that the movement against AUKUS, nuclear submarines, for peace and independence is growing in Australia. In early 2021, 6 weeks after the AUKUS announcement, 28 peace and community groups across Australia called a national Zoom meeting to establish a national coalition to campaign against AUKUS and nuclear submarines and call for peace. The Zoom meeting was attended by 140 people and over 40 organisations. There was unanimous support for the formation of a broad nationwide coalition and campaign to oppose AUKUS and Australia acquiring nuclear submarines. The Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition was launched in March 2022, calling for a national united front against the AUKUS military pact and nuclear submarines, and for building a broad grassroots movement for peace and a nuclear-free Australia. There are branches, anti-AUKUS branches in every state in Australia and also in regional Australia. Events are regularly held in different states with the Anti-AUKUS Coalition calling for national days of actions, example, rallies outside government ministers' offices, public forums, local community meetings. We've got Hiroshima Day coming up. And one of the most successful nationwide activities initiated by the AAAC, that's the Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition, was a petition and statement, a call for peace, calling on the government to cancel submarines and AUKUS and not to go into a US war with China. The petition statement was signed by over 1,000 individuals, and that's within the 6 weeks. Signed by 1,000 individuals and organisations within 6 to 8 weeks, and published in 2 main national newspapers. In a matter of 6, we raised 24,000 in donations to cover the cost of placing the petition as an advertisement in the 2 newspapers. The campaign to stop AUKUS and cancel nuclear submarines is also being taken up by unions. A number of unions have passed resolutions calling on the government to cancel AUKUS and nuclear subs. AUKUS and nuclear submarines are discussed at union conferences and delegates meetings. More unions leaders are coming out, speaking out publicly at forums and rallies. But they're still small, and those that are taking that public position are very courageous in face of immense pressure from the Labor government and the ALP. The US wants nuclear submarines to be based in one of the ports on the eastern coast of Australia. Port Kembla, a mining and steel-making town in southern New South Wales, is the preferred location for basing nuclear submarines for its deep water sport and an exclusion zone. Local unions and communities rose up in arms, mounting a major grassroots campaign to stop the submarines. Their demand is not here, not anywhere, nowhere in Australia. Over the past 2 to 3 years, Port Kembla unions and the local Wollongong community have been developing a plan to transition from fossil fuel, that's coal mining, to renewable energy. The stationing of nuclear submarines in their port would scuttle their program for transition to local renewables economy and long-term secure jobs. The Wollongong community and Port Kembla unions are drawing nationwide support from other unions and communities across the country. Port Kembla unions and community are inspiring other unions and communities. Some unions are passing resolutions pledging unwavering support for Port Kembla people. Around the country, more unions are passing resolutions. Peace is union business slogan is beginning to resound with more unionists and workers, and it is getting traction. And it's something that maybe we should talk to our friends in New Zealand. The opposition is also spreading more widely in the community and amongst Labor Party rank and file branches. Rank and file members in more than 12 local ALP branches around Australia are passing resolutions calling on the government to cancel AUKUS and nuclear submarines and for an independent inquiry. ALP rank and file members have set up Labor Against War and Labor for Peace. ALP local branches are sending their resolutions to government members and to the ALP National Conference, which will be held on the 17th to 18th of August. Unions are planning to put up motions at this national conference to stop nuclear subs and AUKUS. Statements signed by academics, former politicians and Defence Department personnel are also being circulated and promoted. And even though the Labor government has abandoned even appearance of independence, there's no doubt the US is exerting strong pressure to keep Australia in its view of its influence and one of its most reliable allies. Building a broad mass movement on the ground, united to stop AUKUS and nuclear submarines and work for peace is essential. A regional non-aligned peace movement of the people to push back the US imperialist war preparations is crying out to be built. A movement that's not aligned with any imperialist big power, but unites for an independent and nuclear-free Australia. And we hope we can build that movement together with our friends in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And just to finish my talk, at the conclusion of the annual Australian-US ministerial talks in Brisbane this weekend, US Defence Secretary Austin and Australian Defence Minister Miles jointly announced accelerated US militarisation of Australia. More US Marines rotating through the Northern Australia, more US warships and warplanes, and more nuclear-powered submarines visiting Australia, and the production of US missiles, their US missiles in Australia. So finally, I would like to conclude with a quote from a book by former intelligence officer with the Australian Defence Force, Clinton Fernandez. Some of you may have heard of him, but he really should be read. In his book, Australia, a Sub-Imperial Power, Australia in the International Arena, he said, you cannot have an independent foreign policy when you are a dependent economy. So I'll just leave you with that thought. And thank you for the long talk.
It's all right, Shirley, it's not long at all.
I thought it was a bit long.
Okay, I don't have a written speech, so I'll just sort of talk impromptu. A couple of things that Bevan mentioned. It was fascinating to hear. It's fascinating for New Zealanders to hear mention of ANZUS because it's basically so long ago. From our point of view, I'll give you an example. I think it was 2017. I went and spoke to some students, tertiary students in Auckland, and gave a talk about sort of the peace movement. And at the end of it, a student journalist came up and said she wanted to thank me for talking about ANZUS because she'd never met anyone that had come from that generation that had anything to do with ANZUS, and she had learnt about it at high school as history. And so she was quite fascinated to actually hear that it had been a real thing in the lifetime of people older than her. The other thing is that just last Monday night, a 3-part BBC TV series on the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior finished on New Zealand television. I assume it's been shown in Australia. It was called Murder in the South Pacific, or Murder in the Pacific. And it's worth noting that this was actually an act of war, an act of state terrorism committed in New Zealand waters, but in 1985, including the killing of somebody. But our ANZUS partners, America and Australia, did absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And in fact, when the New Zealand police tracked one of the 3 murder teams of the French intelligence agents to Australia, I'm trying to remember it was Norfolk Island or Lord Howe Island, they sailed their yacht to, the yacht that transported the explosives into New Zealand. The Australian police gave the New Zealand cops 24 hours to lay charges or let the Frenchmen go. And the New Zealand cops who were interviewed on this BBC series said they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it within 24 hours. So those 4 French commando killers were allowed to sail out of Australia and back to France and have never been charged with anything. So that's just a bit of historical context. That was ANZUS and the use it was for New Zealand. Now, AUKUS, another kettle of fish, but different here. you've got a grassroots movement in Aussie. Here we've actually had the elite, the sort of insiders, have come out against it to a certain degree. When AUKUS was first announced in 2021, New Zealand was not invited to join because, of course, we're nuclear free and probably we're too small and irrelevant. Interestingly, of the Five Eyes, we're part of Five Eyes. Interestingly, of the Five Eyes countries, Canada wasn't invited to join either. I have no idea why, but only 3 of the Eyes are involved in AUKUS. New Zealand and Canada aren't. So Jacinda Ardern was the Prime Minister in 2021, and she just said, well, we're nuclear free, so we're not involved. We're involved in nuclear submarines. Those submarines will not be allowed to come into New Zealand ports. They won't be allowed to come into New Zealand territorial waters. And that was assumed to be the end of the subject. But no, when it actually kicked off officially in March this year, 2023, when you had Biden, Albanese and Sunak all lined up in San Diego saying this is AUKUS, it's launched, then the discussion started really in New Zealand as to whether or not we would be involved in it and what it meant for us. So you then had Helen Clark, who was a Prime Minister here, Labour Prime Minister from 1999 to 2008, and to all intents and purposes a loyal ally of the US. She came out and said New Zealand should stay out of AUKUS. The same sort of as Paul Keating did in Australia, former Labour Prime Minister. Clark said we did not want this, quote, entanglement. That was her word, entanglement. But interestingly, it wasn't just ex-Labour Prime Ministers in New Zealand who came out against AUKUS. A fellow called Jim Bolger, who was National Party Prime Minister, the equivalent of your Liberal Party, from 1990 to 97, 98, he came out publicly against AUKUS this year. And he's quoted as saying that he criticised the Australian submarine buy-up as, quote, beyond comprehension because of the cost and the damage to peace in the Pacific region. Quote, Bolger said that New Zealand certainly doesn't want any such submarines and challenged proponents of the AUKUS deal to defend it. Quote, if you can find any Australian official who can explain why they need nuclear-powered submarines, come and tell me. I'd like to know. And the journalist quoted Jim Bolger, Liberal Prime Minister, saying rhetorically, how mad are we getting? She says he spoke with despair about the near-daily threats of nuclear war, which had the potential to destroy the planet, unquote. And so that was a National Party Prime Minister who played a major part. He passed the legislation that destroyed the union movement in this country, for example, in 1991. I speak from experience. So you've therefore got 2 former Prime Ministers from the 2 rival parties, the equivalent of the Australian Labor Party and the Australian Liberal Party, both coming out against AUKUS. But not confined to that, I'll give you a quote here from an article by a former Green Party MP, they're represented in Parliament. We weren't invited to join AUKUS, and Australian nuclear submarines won't be allowed to berth here under our nuclear-free legislation. That same legislation sees New Zealand as only a friend and not an ally of the United States, but we're increasingly acting like we are an ally. In the years since New Zealand's principal decision not to join the invasion of Iraq, we have become more enmeshed with the United States defence apparatus. And there's a guy called Gareth Hughes, who was a former Green MP, and he points out, while we aren't required by treaty obligations to act if America or Taiwan are attacked, we are if Australia is. It is not an exaggeration to say Australia could be a target in a future war, and already the country has been threatened with missile attacks in that scenario. The risks of New Zealand being dragged in are real. Unlike in Australia, the conversation in New Zealand has been much more muted, with limited discussion on the likelihood of war. Why aren't we talking about it? New Zealand is in a difficult situation, contemplating conflict between our largest trading partner, China, and traditional security partner, the US. And he goes on to say, our troops fought together in Afghanistan and later served together in Iraq. Rocket Lab, a private company, an American company, started as a New Zealand company, launches US Air Force payloads, and we remain in the intelligence inner circle as a Five Eyes nation. Points out that New Zealand has taken part in naval exercises with nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed ships of America and Australia, etc. And says former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern even received an unprecedented invitation to attend a NATO leaders summit in Europe last year. And it's worth pointing out that her successor, Chris Hipkins, attended the 2023 NATO summit this month in Lithuania. It's also, I'm not sure if you two are aware, New Zealand has a general election, October the 14th. We have considerably less snap elections in Australia too. So this is the routine every 3-year general election. And depending on what polls you listen to, there's every chance of a change of government from a Labor government to a National Party government. New Zealanders, still quoting Gareth Hughes, New Zealanders need to talk more about the risks. Our decision makers need to explain why New Zealand is aligning more closely with the United States military. And as a sovereign country, we have to ask, are we acting independently or as a cog in a machine? Our role could be focused on reducing tensions, finding solutions and building trust. And I pointed out, I'm quoting from an article I wrote on AUKUS. Former politicians right across the spectrum have come out against AUKUS. For example, a man called Richard Prebble, notorious in New Zealand, one-time Labor cabinet minister, and then later a founder of the extreme right ACT party, neoliberal party. He is currently a relentless right-wing critic of the current Labor government. He wrote a column, he's a regular column in New Zealand's biggest newspaper. His take on AUKUS is the classic mercantilist one. Quote, China is New Zealand's biggest trading partner. This country has joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. China has signed a free trade agreement with New Zealand, something the US Senate refuses to consider. We signed a free trade agreement in 2008 with China. And as recently as a month ago, Hipkins led the first delegation from a Western country to visit China and personally meet Xi Jinping. He took 39 leading New Zealand capitalists with him a week after he returned from the NATO summit in Lithuania. So New Zealand is trying to have 50 cents either way. To go back to quoting Richard Prebble, the right winger, New Zealand has no territorial disputes with China. When we recognised the government of China 50 years ago, we acknowledged Taiwan as part of China. Paul Keating and Helen Clark are correct. New Zealand's strategic interest is in the peaceful resolution of conflicts with China rather than sleepwalking into anti-Chinese alliances. So that's from the right. The right of the National Party. This is the equivalent of what? The Country Party or whatever it's called now in Australia. I mean, he's a founder of a party that if the National Party gets into government, they will be in coalition with National. From the sort of grassroots, Mike Treen, a veteran union leader and left-wing activist, wrote a column on a thing called the Daily Blog, saying New Zealand was wrong to join the war against Afghanistan. We were wrong to join the occupation of Iraq. We were wrong to become an quote-unquote observer at NATO, and it would be foolish and dangerous to become a participant in any way with the AUKUS military provocation against China. New Zealand should be a neutral power that offers medical aid to the world, not a tiny jumped-up militarised puppet of the US empire that Australia has become, unquote. And then we go to the present ruling class. In March this year, a man called Mr. Kurt Campbell, the White House National Security Council coordinator, visited New Zealand, and he met with New Zealand's Labor government defence minister called Andrew Little, and Andrew Little said he was interested in New Zealand joining, quote, the second pillar of AUKUS, which will involve defence technologies, quote, associated with the nuclear-powered submarines, such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced information technology. That's what the present New Zealand Minister of Defence said in March. Quote, he said, the Defence Force needed to maintain its technology to the standard of its Australian and American counterparts so the militaries could communicate while working together. He said he was, quote, quite satisfied this aspect of the AUKUS agreement would be separate from any nuclear hardware. He said he told Kurt Campbell any participation by New Zealand could not compromise legal obligations and our moral commitment to being nuclear free. We already work very closely with allies and partners who have nuclear-powered vessels and submarines and nuclear-armed missiles and submarines. That doesn't change anything that we're currently doing. So that's what our Defence Minister said in March. He was then, that was disputed by both the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nanaia Mahuta, and by the Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins. And Mahuta made a May 23 speech saying that New Zealand's nuclear-free position is a cornerstone of our independent stance. That is wavering, because this week, as I mentioned before at the start of this webinar, we've had two visitors, not to Christchurch, to Wellington, under the guise of coming to watch the Women's Football World Cup. And so Anthony Albanese was in Wellington on Wednesday, drinking craft beer and trying sausage rolls and shaking hands with people. And on the same day, with the two Anthonys, Anthony Blinken was in Wellington ostensibly to watch the US play the Netherlands in the Women's Football World Cup, but also to meet the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Prime Minister, and talk about AUKUS. And he said, US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken says, quote unquote, door very much open for New Zealand to join non-nuclear aspects of AUKUS. That's what he said on Wednesday before he flew to Canberra, where he met with Penny Wong, Richard Marles, Albanese, etc., etc. And the New Zealand government was quoted as saying, Nanaia Mahuta, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, she afterwards confirmed that while Aotearoa had, quote, not committed to anything at this point, unquote, and was, quote, not contemplating joining AUKUS, unquote, that at an officials level, the government was exploring what participating in AUKUS's second pillar, the sharing of cutting-edge military technologies, would look like. There was no timeline for Cabinet making decisions about this, she said. The confirmation appeared to settle months of uncertainty over the government's view of the defence pact between the United States, United Kingdom and Australia. The pact conflicts with New Zealand's ban of nuclear weapons and power. So there's obviously pressure being put on by the Americans as recently as this week. And there's obviously within the New Zealand government, which at present is Labour, it may not be after October, and within the Cabinet there's obviously differences of opinion. And I haven't even mentioned the sort of the position of what's going on in sort of the Pacific in relationship to AUKUS. But I mean, so we talked about the implications for New Zealand. I'm quoting a political journalist now who wrote last year, right-wing political journalist for the biggest chain of newspapers in the country. Ardern now has the practical distinction of being the most pro-US Prime Minister since Sir Robert Muldoon. Now, Piggy Muldoon was Prime Minister of New Zealand 1975 to 84. He was the one that forced the issue of the nuclear warships, and he used to invite them out. He used to invite them out during school holidays so that the seafarers would go and strike and the public would get pissed off with the unions. And it was the backlash against Muldoon that led to the succeeding Labour government making New Zealand nuclear free. So it's not actually very complimentary to hear a right-wing journalist congratulating Jacinda Ardern as having been the most pro-US New Zealand Prime Minister since Muldoon. In 2022, she became the first ever New Zealand Prime Minister to attend a NATO Leaders Summit. Her successor, Chris Hipkins, attended the one this month in Lithuania. So New Zealand is actively supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia. There is an irony in our government being so invested in a war and its attendant geopolitics on the other side of the world, while right next door to home, our Aussie big brother is making a major push via AUKUS and towards war via AUKUS and accompanying militarisation. The reason we called this webinar is because I don't think New Zealanders grasp the full implications and sheer scale of what is happening next door. I mean, when Bevan was talking, I got a question sent through saying $368 billion, exclamation mark. And yes, that's right. I mean, that's a staggering amount of money. I mean, New Zealand papers ran, when that was announced in March, they ran headlines from the Sydney Morning Herald saying, quote, "We are not at war, but neither are we at peace." And this is sort of Australian journalists sort of saying that, you know, this is, we can't pretend this is anything other than a serious preparation for war down the track. And they were quoting sort of Peter Dutton, the leader of the opposition, saying, oh, well, we'll trade off this money against sort of, you know, social welfare spending, et cetera, et cetera. So this has implications for us. We can't simply shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, we don't care. It's to do with nuclear submarines, so we're nuclear free, so it's nothing to do with us. AUKUS is about more than nuclear submarines. In 2022, 3 partners in it announced they were going to develop hypersonic missiles, which the Russians have been using in Ukraine. So obviously the Americans have been caught on the back foot. So AUKUS is going to get into that stuff. And then we have this rather vaguely undefined second pillar of AUKUS, which is what is tempting the Americans are using to tempt New Zealand. And I mean, the point made in the article I read out, or I quoted from Gareth Hughes, the former Green MP, the Americans are simply going round New Zealand's nuclear-free ban. They tried to squash it back in the day. They actually used their old mate Bob Hawke, who was despised in New Zealand because he was used as the front man for Australia, for the Americans to try to get New Zealand to drop being nuclear-free. That didn't work. It backfired completely. So now, 40 years later, they're sort of going around the end of the nuclear-free ban and simply saying, here's the other things that you can get involved in. And actually, for Bevan's benefit, there was. I mean, when the New Zealand Navy had its 70th anniversary in 2016, the then New Zealand government invited an American warship to come and take part in it. But it was the first American warship invited to New Zealand since the 1980s. And they went through some elaborate charade of saying that, well, you know, we'll neither confirm nor deny, but wink, wink, there's no nuclear weapons on board. So there was the key government, the previous national government, invited the Americans to send a warship out here. It's interesting, if there is a change of government, and the polls are saying there probably will be in October, the National Party is more pro-Chinese than the Labour Party. John Key, who was Prime Minister, a Liberal Party Prime Minister from 2008 until 2017, when 2016, when he resigned, he was recently quoted as saying that China didn't pose a threat to New Zealand, they're a major trade partner, etc., etc. And the way that whole relationship was expressed when National was in office, up until 6 years ago, was that New Zealand looked to America for security and China for trade. And New Zealand, unlike Australia, has not gone out of its way to annoy China. So there's been no bans or anything of any New Zealand products going to China, unlike some of the Australian stuff. Nothing like that has happened. And when Hipkins went to Beijing just a few weeks ago and got to personally meet with Xi Jinping, which Xi Jinping went out of his way to say they'd always regarded New Zealand as a friend. And not just simply, you know, so there's a sort of a delicate balancing act going on between carrying favour with the Americans on the one hand, who are treating us as a partner but not an ally anymore because of the nuclear free thing, and relationship with China, who is New Zealand's biggest trading partner bar none. And there's a close relationship. And funnily enough, when National was in government, there were more scandals involving China than anything under Labour. For example, one National Member of Parliament, Chinese member, was revealed to have had personal connections to Chinese intelligence before he came to New Zealand. He'd worked at a school training Chinese intelligence officers, and there were whole lots of scandals involving money, etc., financing sort of Tory politicians. So the relationship between New Zealand and China would probably be stronger under a right-wing Conservative government if they followed the same pattern as their last predecessors, who were in office from 08 until 17. Labour always tries to go out of its way to say, you know, look, we're a good, dependable sort of, you know, flying the flag. Jacinda Ardern, when she was Prime Minister, used to regularly say, we have a fiercely independent foreign policy, but in actual the facts contradict that totally. And they've sort of missed the boat. And I mean, we're a member of Five Eyes, and have been since the foundation. We host a spy base at Waihopai in the South Island here, and we still, to this day, have in this city, Christchurch, an American military transport base that's been here since 1955, despite nuclear-free New Zealand and the ANZUS rail. It's their jumping-off point for going to Antarctica. And it used to be, it's not now, it used to be the jumping-off point for servicing Pine Gap. They used to fly all the stuff through here, in and out, from the States through New Zealand and on into Richmond Air Force Base in New South Wales, and then on to Alice Springs and back out. So they're still here to this day. And a reduced sort of, yep, we're going to knock it on the head, Linda.
Just conscious of time, and we do have a lot of...
It's after 7 o'clock, quarter past. So I'll wrap it up there. It has major implications for New Zealand, and they will become more and more apparent as time goes on. Okay, I'll shut up.
Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Just want to thank all of our three speakers. What I'm going to do now is we've come to the question and discussion part of our hui. So you'll see something pop up on your screen that says you've been invited to be a panelist. That's the only way that we can open people up to be able to see and hear you. So if you want to be part of the chat, discussion, questions, etc., just accept that invite. Now I've just got to go through the list and do that for everyone. So people will just slowly, hopefully, accept that, and we'll start showing up. You'll need to turn your camera on once you accept that invite. Seems to be working. While we're just going through this process, I was really encouraged to hear, Shirley, about trade unions taking up the challenge in Australia. And that's definitely going to be something that I take away from this meeting. A good challenge. Murray, will you facilitate this part of the meeting?
Okay, all right. So I'm just typing an answer. All right, people got questions, comments, and discussion. I don't see any cameras on. No.
Murray, if you change your view,
Change my view.
to gallery, just in the top right where it says view,
Yeah.
change to gallery.
Yeah, okay, righto.
And there are some people with hands up.
Right, okay.
Do you see those, Murray?
I do, yes.
Great.
Okay, so starting, I'm just typing an answer to Joe Valentine. Okay, so I'll start from the top left-hand corner, David Small.
Oh, kia ora, everybody. Thanks very much for those really interesting presentations. Just a quick question for the Australians, or about Australia in particular, in relation to the Papua New Guinean agreement with the Americans on that military base, and those things that have been announced there recently. Is there evidence of Australia kind of actively leaning on that? Is there any sense of anybody know of how much actual sort of support there is in that with Papua New Guinea? I mean, the Americans, once they saw the Solomons going with China, they've obviously gone hard to get something there. Has anybody got anything to share on that? Thanks.
Bevan or Shirley, do you want to answer that?
Bevan, do you want to go first?
Well, I was going to say that I think Blinken and the US caught us off guard. From reading in the press, there was very little advance warning that the Yanks were going to sign an agreement with Papua New Guinea. Of course, as President of Australian leadership would be quite supportive of that happening. There's no doubt about that. But we weren't given much advance notice of that happening, as far as from the press side of it, from my reading of the press.
Shirley, you want anything to say about that?
Yeah, just briefly. Australia's got a kind of a dual role in the region. It is, I think it's quite correctly characterised as a deputy sheriff for the US. So a lot of the stuff that it's doing, like in the South Pacific and New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, a lot of the things that it's doing is upholding that the US and implementing the US global US-based, rules-based order. It's allied itself with that. But Australia also has its own, or some of the Australian companies also have their own interests that they want to pursue under that umbrella of the US in Papua New Guinea and in the Solomon Islands. I get a sense that what Penny Wong's been doing in Solomon and in the South and in the South Pacific Islands is basically, well, that's my interpretation of it. And knowing how Penny Wong, sort of the comments that she has come out with, she's making out that she's a kind of that Australia is neutral in all this, and they want to assist the South Pacific Island in the development. But I really get a sense that this is all part of the US agenda, and Australia is just performing its own role in the region. With the Papua New Guinea, David, I think there's there's probably two aspects to Australia's role in there. But certainly America would have been putting pressure on Australia to take that front row seat.
Does that answer your question, David?
Yep, thank you.
All right, Joe Valentine.
Yeah, hello everyone. So many thanks to Bevan and Shirley. Great talks, and Murray, as usual, full of articulate comments. Thank you. But I have put a question in about your upcoming election. Is there any chance that you could get candidates ahead of time to reiterate opposition to that second leg of ANZUS? Don't be seduced by the Americans. They're very good at seduction. We know that. And we're totally enmeshed. We'd love New Zealand, or I would love New Zealand to maintain its independence, although it's not complete. I understand that as well.
I'll give you an answer to that, Joe. I've just sent you a written reply, but I didn't mention this stuff in my talk. But rather unusually, one of the parliamentary parties, New Zealand has a proportional representation system, so there's 5 parties in Parliament, and the smallest is called the Maori Party, Te Pāti Maori. And they announced their foreign policy back in February or something. And rather astonishingly, they said that if the Labour Party wants them to be a coalition partner with them after the October election, they would require New Zealand to leave the Five Eyes Alliance. And they also put out, I mean, when I found their foreign policy press statement, which wasn't in the media, they said the age of imperialism, war and spy alliances is over. And this coming from a party representing Maori, who constitute a very considerable proportion of the New Zealand military and have a legendary sort of role in New Zealand military history, this is extremely significant, because when the Maori Party was founded in the first decade of this century, they actually enabled a national party government to exist, because they went into coalition with the National, having walked out of the Labour Party. They were former Labour MPs. So for them to now say, the National Party said, we'll have nothing to do with them if we won't ask them to be in coalition with us. So you have the Green Party that have, I think, 9 MPs at the moment. They're opposed to Five Eyes, etc. But they don't use words like imperialism, etc. in parliamentary speeches and press releases. And the Maori Party has actually doubled down on this stuff. You know, when the media picked up on it, they actually reiterated this in interviews that they would require New Zealand to get out of Five Eyes. The reaction from the Prime Minister was that these little wee parties needed to be very careful what they were seeking, because they might just get left completely out of the big boys' negotiations. Just in the last couple of days, the Maori Party have said that they want a wealth tax or a capital gains tax as a substantial part of any coalition agreement. And so they're really pushing the envelope. Whether it's relevant, I mean, the polls at the moment say that the Tories will win the election, but I mean, who knows? I mean, so, but I just thought I'd let you know that one party that's actually in Parliament at the moment, not on the sidelines, has actually said we want to turn our back on, quote, imperialism, war and killing, and we want New Zealand to get out of Five Eyes because we've got nothing out of it.
Well, so, I think that's fantastic. Thank you for that. It's a bit of
encouragement. That's not the Labour Party. Nobody in the Labour Party uses words like that.
But something else
run a bloody mile.
Something else that we haven't really mentioned is the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty.
Yes.
SPINFIZ, as it was called in 1985. I believe that AUKUS absolutely contravenes that treaty.
Oh,
and of course, a lot of the South Pacific nations have expressed disquiet about AUKUS. So we need to build that up too in the Pacific. And it makes me really cross when I hear our government talk about our Pacific family. Well, that's bullshit, really, unless you're prepared to treat your family really badly.
I mean, when I was going through the list of elite New Zealanders who are opposed to AUKUS, I did not mention a very prominent right-wing academic who's on TV news every night saying New Zealand should do more for helping Ukraine. He's come out, a guy called Robert Patman, for the benefit of the New Zealanders on this webinar, and he's come out very conclusively against AUKUS and listed half a dozen points in an article about why New Zealand should have nothing to do with AUKUS. One of the things was that New Zealand is pushing sort of the abolition of nuclear weapons. And for example, Southeast Asian nations, with the exception of Singapore, ASEAN nations, have all signed up to that sort of treaty. So this guy, who's a sort of a right-winger on all sorts of stuff, has sort of said, well, you know, I mean, AUKUS, who needs it? And he actually directly contradicted what the Americans and Australians are saying about it. Okay, Paul Bonder. Hang on, I'll unmute you, Paul. There you go.
You can do
There
it.
you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that book that Shirley mentioned, Australia as a sub-imperial power, because I think it enabled me to understand the Australian position. I recommend it to people. Maybe you could put it in the chat, Shirley, because I think it's a great book.
Yeah.
And the other thing I just wondered about the Aboriginal voice in terms of whether there is one in terms of AUKUS.
Is that a question to the speakers? What do you want to know? Is there an Aboriginal component to the peace movement opposition to AUKUS? Is that
Yeah,
Paul?
yeah.
Okay, Bevan or Shirley, would you like to speak to that?
Well, IPAN, of course, has a strong position on supporting Indigenous people of Australia, but we don't have overtly any statement from Indigenous people's organisations about AUKUS that I know of. Shirley may be better known about that, but I don't know of anything particularly coming from Aboriginal community about AUKUS and the nuclear subs. What do you know, Shirley?
I don't know either. Some people here know that IPAN, Independent Peaceful Australia Network, we released a public inquiry, a people's inquiry into the US-Australia alliance, and one of the areas we were looking at was the First Nations people, and that was led by one of the Terry Mason, who's one of the First Nations activists, long-time activist, and he himself has quite strong views on the Australia-US alliance, but there hasn't been anything publicly, and I think one of the reasons is because at the moment people, and Joe might add a bit too, there has the big issue at the moment in Australia is a referendum on the yes vote, and that's really taking up enormous amount of resources and attention by the First Nations people. However, the issue about the storage of nuclear waste dump on First Nations land, that is a really important issue for the First Nations people. So maybe Joe's closer to that. Maybe Joe could mention it.
Yes, well, actually, at every opportunity, I try and give Aboriginal people a copy of Charting Our Own Course, a fabulous document pointing out that the Indigenous issues come up in the first chapter. That is the first chapter. So they're generally very pleased to see that. Also in Western Australia, just the beginnings of a campaign to get Indigenous people to reclaim Garden Island, which is where Stirling Naval Base is, which was where a lot of the nuclear submarines are due to visit and then be based. I mean, that will probably never happen, but it's quite a good rallying point. And yes, I agree with Shirley. People are so busy with this referendum about constitutional recognition of Indigenous people in this country, long overdue, and also they have so many issues of survival to deal with all the time. So I'm not surprised that we don't have a strong Aboriginal component, officially speaking out with IPAN.
Just
to
add to that, say that Australia has a truly appalling history of matters nuclear when it comes to its Indigenous people. That, I mean, back in the 50s,
Absolutely.
Up into the 60s, they allowed Britain to test nuclear weapons, atmospheric nuclear weapons tests in the Central Australian desert, and did nothing to sort of get the Aboriginal people out of the way because they weren't regarded as frankly worth being worried about. And I can remember meeting elders in Alice Springs who had been, as young people, affected by those tests, and in one case left blinded, precisely because of atmospheric nuclear testing on the Australian mainland. Okay, David, we'll unmute you.
If I might continue there, Murray, to say that yes, because of that, there is strong concern in the Indigenous communities about radioactive waste And
Right.
the people in South Australia at Kimber, I think it is, an Indigenous community, they've just had a victory to prevent a waste dump being opened up there, although it's going to be subject to an appeal, obviously, in the courts. But they had a victory in preventing proposed development of a nuclear dump waste on their backyard. They stopping that. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Back to David again. You've got your hand up, David.
Oh, Murray, before we go back to David, there was a question in the chat from Jeremy, who has now
Oh, okay.
joined and can ask that. Do you ask that for yourself there, Jeremy?
Yeah, sorry. I guess one thing I've kind of noticed in the last few years in terms of how things seem to have looked for Australian foreign policy is you see a lot of advocacy being done by the likes of ASPI for essentially American interests. I guess in terms of how that all works, is that something that you're actually seeing on the ground there, or is it a misapprehension, I guess?
Oh no, we're very concerned about ASPI. It's funded by
Can you explain
defence contractors.
what this outfit is? Can you explain to the audience?
Australian Strategic Policy
Policy Institute.
Okay. ASPI, right? Yep.
Yeah.
What you
And
go-
they claim to be a think tank that advises the government, but their documentation and what they say is very strongly pro-US, and we criticise it very often in IPAN, stuff they put out, but they're funded by both the Defence Department and defence contractors in a big way, and they just parrot those interests.
And I also add that they actually have an office in America, just recently established. So we reckon they get a lot of their orders from there.
Okay. All right. David.
I've already had a go, so somebody else wants to
Nobody
go.
else has got their hand up, so
Right. All right. So
Murray, Jeff Fisher has his hand up.
does he? Okay. I don't see it.
Sorry, David.
all
Yeah,
good.
I do have my hand up.
Okay. All right. Where you go, Jeff?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Murray. It seems we've heard quite a bit about two of the partners in AUKUS, that is the United States and Australia. But I haven't heard much mention of the third partner, which is the United Kingdom. And it seems to me that we will always have this problem of our two countries being subordinate to foreign powers, so long as we have colonial regimes and government. Now, to me, the connection to the United Kingdom, although it does not seem to be central to this issue, I feel it is, and that if we can become independent, I mean, if our nations become independent from the United Kingdom, we will then develop a culture of independence that will also make us independent of other powers such as the United States, or for that matter, China. So, and frankly, I cannot see either New Zealand or Australia becoming independent with respect to the United States while they remain constitutionally subordinate to the United Kingdom. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay.
Well, the colonial dependence thing is in the back of our minds in Australia, of course, and the leadership all the time. But as I explained in my talk, dependence on a big power changed to the United States during the Second World War, and there's no doubt that the United States is the dominant foreign power influencing our country at the moment. It's interesting that colonial trapping, left behind stuff from the UK, was instrumental in getting rid of an Australian government which the United States didn't want.
That's right.
Now, in 75, the United States destabilised the Labor government under Whitlam, and the exchange of letters that we've seen from the CIA to the Asia and so on, about Whitlam being a threat to his own country, a security threat to his own country, needed to get rid of, they had to use a part of the Constitution which was little known at the time, which the British had set up. The reserve power in the Constitution was their reserve right to override an Australian elected government. That reserve power had been put in the Constitution for the purpose of them being able to, the British, being able to override it. It was used by Governor General Sir John Kerr, who had also been a president of an American CIA-funded organisation, the Cultural Freedom Association, so he was in their pockets. But to get rid of the Australian government, Whitlam government at the time, they used part of the Constitution set up by the British. Now, if we do become independent in Australia, that Constitution has to be rewritten, right? A lot of it has to change, and that reserve power removed, of course. But it's really a struggle in Australia to be independent of big powers, whether it's the UK or the US. Our struggle is to have an independent foreign policy and stand on our own feet. Shirley.
Yes, well, I just suggest that New Zealand and Australia are both democracies only so long as King Charles chooses not to exercise his reserve powers. And that's a very hazardous state for any nation to be in.
Right.
And that is why I think we must get rid of this colonial connection if we are to have anything like a genuine democracy, anything like a genuinely independent foreign policy.
Shirley.
I'll just add that running parallel to the stream for Australia's independence is also the Republican movement. So they are running in that same direction, side by side. So there are calls, and have been calls for a long time, for Australia to become a republic free of Britain. Our current Prime Minister Albanese, before he was from the Labor left, whatever that means, he was, before he was elected, he prided himself as being a Republican. And the day that 2 days after he got in, he was voted in, he suddenly decided that, the Australian people don't want a republic at the moment, so he's not going to push it. So that gives, but there is, the two are running parallel, and to have an independence, we need to be a republic, and really the logical extension of a republic is a really truly independent Australia.
I can give you a quote here, Jeff, from Paul Keating. I said that he came out in opposition to it the day after Albanese, after AUKUS was officially declared. Keating really put the boot into it. And here's one quote: "Every Labor Party branch member will wince when they realise that the party we all fight for is returning to our former colonial master Britain to find our security in Asia, 236 years after Europeans first grabbed the continent from its indigenous people. That of all things, a contemporary Labor government is shunning security in Asia for security in and within the Anglosphere." So there's plenty of opposition in Aussie to much more than in New Zealand, for that matter. This is not even on the agenda here. David, you've got your hand up again. So
yeah, look, sorry, I just wanted to ask a question about the one of the other perhaps elephants in the room in relation to AUKUS. Macron's just been in New Caledonia this week, and things are in an interesting impasse there, and France was kind of blindsided and got its nose out of joint with AUKUS, because I think one of the direct impacts was Australia cancelled its submarine order from France to sign up for these uber expensive ones from the US, and also in relation to France US kind of banging the drum for for treating everything in relation to China as malign and aggressive. France is kind of backpedaling a bit on that. So anybody got anything to comment about how they see that sort of fly in the ointment, as it were?
Bevan and or Shirley.
Look, there's a number of ways of interpreting the cancellation of the French submarine order in favour of the US-UK subs. And one is that whether we get the actual subs ourselves at all, they want to have ports in Australia, Western Australia on the East Coast, the United Kingdom and United States nuclear submarines. And this has been facilitated, wouldn't have been easily done if Australia continued buying the French submarines. The whole thing wouldn't have come up about the possibility of AUKUS and the ports on the East Coast and West Coast, the US and UK submarines. There's more than one way of looking at what that was all about. Some of us in Australia wonder if we would ever get these nuclear submarines, but certainly we're going to get them in Western Australia in 2027. It's been said they will host or port UK, US nuclear subs then, and if they build the coast port in the East Coast, Port Kembla or other places, then there'll be a place there for them too. So there's more than one way of looking at what that cancellation of the French order involved, or what the purpose of it.
Shirley.
The other aspect about France is that France still hankers to retain its colonial foot in the South Pacific nations. And and I think it was interesting that Macron had actually not long ago commented that that he was calling for a different kind of alliance apart from NATO and based around the South Pacific. So France also has its own ambitions, continues to have its own colonial ambitions and its foothold in the South Pacific, in the Pacific, basically. Yes. So there are kind of within like NATO and the Western countries are not, they're not homogeneous. There's within them, there are also competing interests. Yes. So, and I think that France has its own agenda, and I think they're really pissed off that they couldn't get their subs. Australia couldn't get, lock back their subs, and America's now is having a greater presence and influence in the Pacific.
Just on that, so go on, carry on.
No. I just want to mention that within that there are competing interests, and France still has its own colonial ambitions to retain some of its presence in the Pacific.
Just very briefly on that, for your benefit, David, in the article I wrote about AUKUS, I said that the cancellation of the submarine order, Scott Morrison went behind the backs of the French in order to instead do a deal with the US and UK. It led to the most extraordinary diplomatic bust-up between those countries. France recalled its ambassadors from both Australia and the US. It's America's oldest ally dating back to the American Revolution. President Macron called Morrison, quote unquote, a liar. When Morrison was voted out a few months later in 2022, France's outgoing foreign minister said, quote, "I can't stop myself from saying that the defeat of Morrison suits me very well." So there we are. So don't underestimate. I mean, for the French to withdraw their ambassador from the US was a big, big deal. It had never, ever happened before about anything. So now, Stephanie McKee, you've got your hand up.
Murray, we've also, Laurie has her hand up, her actual hand.
Her actual hand, okay. Well, Stephanie, then Laurie, where is your unmute, Stephanie? Can you?
So, I'm not on mute.
Greetings. Good. Okay, right.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Greetings, everyone. Thank you very much for organising this webinar, and very good to hear those the history and of what's been happening in Australia, I actually want to invite Laurie to comment on what I'm about to say. I'd like to bring her voice in as someone who has been a driving force of nuclear-free New Zealand for decades. I just want to read 2 sentences, and it's basically the big picture. Well, the New Zealand military budget in last year's quote well-being budget, military spending was a total of 6,077 million. I think that's right.
Might be billion,
It's got-
million.
Billion. It's got 9, 10 numbers in it anyway.
Yeah.
An average of more than 116 million every week. And that was a 10% increase on the actual spending in 2021.
Right.
And just the correlating comment, it's truly shameful that military spending continues to rise in the midst of ongoing social inequities and the rapidly worsening climate catastrophe. Now, I noted that our Australian friends mentioned exactly the same narrative, that the obscenity of this military spending in the context of all these crises, wicked problems of the climate, of housing, of the health system that I've been trying to navigate, it's broken. So that's the big picture, that New Zealand, little old New Zealand, is caught up in militarism. And so I would like my dear friend Laurie Ross just to take this as a starting point and add what she wants to say.
Before I hand over to Laurie, I'll read one paragraph. I quoted an article before from Gareth Hughes, former Green MP, and one paragraph. New Zealand's military spending as a percentage of GDP, gross domestic product, has increased significantly under the Labor government, and big new spends have been focused on interoperability. Okay, that means that so they can operate with American equipment, Australian equipment, etc. This includes the purchase of 4 new P-8A Poseidon aircraft to replace the decades-old P-3 Orions. At 2.3 billion New Zealand dollars, the Poseidon aircraft were much more expensive than alternatives that could have also undertaken search and rescue and fisheries patrol work because of their ability to work with partners and conduct anti-submarine warfare in a future conflict. So there's an example of where 2.3 billion was spent by the previous government to buy 4 planes that could be used to hunt Chinese submarines, not find missing Tongan fishing boats. Laurie, hang on, I'll remove your mute. Wait on.
Right.
Go.
Okay. Kia ora. Thank you, Murray, so much for organizing this webinar. And also, I'm so pleased to hear live, well, very live, Bevan and our friend Shirley. Yes, there we go. Because I have been following your work and attending other webinars and sent you a generous donation for your campaign to get your advertisement into the local newspapers. And I think that's wonderful that you were able to get it in. And I've been looking at how we can help you. Like, I have your latest Roots Action petition to cancel the Talisman Sabre and AUKUS campaign. And what I'm interested in, there's a couple of questions I have, but what I'm interested in is how we can collaborate, how Aotearoa New Zealand can better collaborate. I would like to see a peace alliance, and I'd like to see it start with the peace movement, peace groups. I'm sure we could easily rally up our New Zealand peace groups to support this peace alliance. And I'm just wondering what you Australians think about the idea that we form a peace alliance. So that's one question. My second question is, have you tried lobbying your local councils or each state? You were saying earlier that you have now established peace groups in each state. And one of the, I'm not sure about how many towns, but one of the reasons, or one of the ways in which we achieved our nuclear-free zone country is because in 1982 and 83, we seeded the peace group ethos right throughout the country. We had people like my father, Larry Ross, who started the New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone Committee, going up and down the country and empowering people to establish their own peace group to achieve a nuclear-free New Zealand. And it's very important if you've already got this network in Australia, because you don't have to do it all by post and by people traveling. You can do so much as you're doing online with your webinars and so on. But it seems very important to get in the political action, and rather than just going for MPs or your central government, one of the stepping stones to that, or in that process, is to go to each of your local councils and get them to declare like a Wollongong nuclear-free zone and so on. But it has to be coordinated so that the peace groups are doing it in every state and in as many towns as possible during the next couple of years. And one of the ways in which I would like to see our New Zealand peace movement help you and help ourselves is to cancel not just the future Talisman Sabre, which I think is not in another 2 years because we can't cancel this one, it's already going, but we could be canceling RIMPAC, which I understand is every 2 years as well. So the next one, the last one was last year, the next one will be next year. And I think that's a really good target for our peace movement, because so I would just say for Australia, yes, you want to be nuclear free, and especially in order to stop the nuclear submarines being built and coming in, you know, the whole militarization. I just think it's such a good rallying call for you. So that's like number two. And then I sort of had a third question here, which was, I'm still trying to understand why Australia is so compliant, so subservient in, you know, it's a big country. It's a big country. It's got a great power all by itself. It doesn't need America to tell it what to do or to give it, you know, defense. I mean, you can look after yourselves. But I do understand that New Zealand is in the same sort of a double bind, because we, you know, our best friend is America and Australia, you know, we're best buddies. But New Zealand was able to step out of that sufficiently to declare our nuclear-free zone and still be good buddies, you know, and handle all the flack and then the insults and the ridicule and trying to undermine us, which it carries on. But you know, we're still practicing our peacemaker and diplomacy skills so that we do maintain a good relationship with Australia and America. But my question is really, are there many people, or how could you inspire and empower your people in Australia to take greater pride in their sovereignty, even if they're still connected with America and the UK, but to say, well, although we love you, America and UK or whatever, you know, we're good friends, but we want to put our higher value on being a nuclear-free country and resisting or rejecting any attempt to make us enter into a preparation for warfare with China. I know I might not be saying it in quite the right words, but I think you get the gist of my meaning. And I just wonder, you know, maybe the US is holding such a high, I think I read it in one of my articles, I think it was from John Menadue and Pearls and Irritations. Anyway, something about there's a huge amount of money that America is putting in, you know, investing in Australia. And it's really hard to resist all that money. But maybe there is a way, if Australian people really understood that they were selling out their sovereignty, selling out their health and education and a whole lot of other things for this military industrial complex and for the American way of militarization, domination, and control of the Pacific and of outer space. And that's another whole issue, because that's really where New Zealand is right in that game plan, because we've got Rocket Lab, and my last big campaign was to stop, you know, and unite the peace movement in New Zealand to stop the Rocket Lab contributing to the US warfare combat targeting, which was the Gunsmoke J launch. And I mean, you know, that's why technologically we're still so much value as a second pillar of AUKUS, because we have this, you know, we're one of the 11 spacefaring nations, and of course with Five Eyes, etc. But I just think that if we could build our peace movements, rebuild them, and I'll tell you what I'm doing in a minute to do this, but, you know, just as an idea to offer into this forum, how we could build up our peace alliance between Australia and New Zealand. And also what I'd like to do is maybe reformulate this petition. I'm working on one for our New Zealand government at the moment, but maybe we should have a combined one. And yeah, and because of course it can go online and so on and so forth, so it can all be done very efficiently. Yes, that okay. So that, and then the last point is just to tell you what I'm doing now. So my next big event is Remember Hiroshima, and I'm going back to my knitting, to my grassroots work of 1982, when I established the West Auckland Peace Group here, where I am now, which is Glen Eden and Titirangi of the West Auckland. And rather than go back into the city and do a big event, I've done lots of big events, blah, 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 I'm coming right back to, I want to create a little event for maybe 50 people, but I've got excellent speakers. I have Honorable Matt Robson, who's our former Minister for Disarmament, and I have Professor Tressa Dunworth, who's Associate Professor of Law at Auckland University. And so I've listed for them the topics that they're going to cover. And this is going to be real people, but we will film it so then we can circulate it to all of you and everyone can receive the latest update in how New Zealand is resurrecting or regenerating its peace movement at the grassroots. But the topics we're going to cover are NATO, US, and Russia's war in Ukraine, AUKUS nuclear submarines, stop militarization of the Pacific for war with China, New Zealand's Nuclear Free Zone Disarmament and Arms Control Act of 1987 and what that means today, and how we have to continue to reinforce it, because the price of freedom and democracy is constant vigilance, and this history will be lost and forgotten and buried if we don't keep resurrecting it. And the last point will be the UN Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And of course, I've done a lot of work with IPAN over the years, and I'm just amazed that you have Tilman Ruff and Tim Wright and all these wonderful Australians who are right there on the cutting edge of this treaty. And I think, oh, surely, you know, you Australians can get together and finally convince, persuade, do whatever you need to do to show your Australian government that this is the right side of history, and Australia was leading it, and now, you know, just step into that power and leadership, Australia, and we, the little brother or sisters, will be with you. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. So, Bevan and or Shirley, do you want to respond to that? Or there's at least two questions there. Is there something being done to build opposition to AUKUS at local government level, and why is Australia so subservient to the United States? A rather bigger question. So, do either one of you want to answer that?
I'll start that. And Laurie, I remember you emailed the No AUKUS Victoria when we had that public forum with Peter Garrett, and I got your email. With local councils, there is actually one local council in Melbourne, that's the Mary Back Council, which recently, there are two councillors who are involved in the anti-AUKUS campaign, and they got a motion passed at the Mary Back Council basically opposing, the motion supported making Mary Back a nuclear-free a nuclear-free area. Also, condemning the 368 billion spent on nuclear subs, and instead saying they should be spent on the needs of we've just talked about. That's the housing, the climate, the welfare. It is happening, but that is one of the more progressive councils probably in all of Australia. So I think that there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done in raising awareness. So when I mentioned earlier, and this is what I was going to say now, that when I mentioned earlier about the building of the movement at the grassroots and the outcry, the public outcry to 368 billion, it was before the announcement, before the 368 billion announcement, it was still very small awareness or interest in AUKUS. It was the 368 billion that really triggered off that outrage, because it was concrete, it was practical, and it had an immediate impact on people's lives. So and that's what we are using, how we're building the movement on the ground, on the ground at the grassroots. And unless we do that in local communities, have public forums, public meetings, have rallies in local shopping centres, unless we do that groundwork, it'll be very hard. So which leads to the next question about the Australian, why Australia is not, or Australian government are so subservient to the US. And I think it goes back to what Bevan mentioned, the history, is that Australia's incredible subservience and appendage to foreign powers, the British and then the Australian. So it is so entrenched in our institutions and in our history. So that needs to be challenged. But the other aspect is that Australia is a very, very important strategic, plays a very important strategic role for the US. It's like a bastion. It's a US bastion in the Asia Pacific, the deputy sheriff. So it rolls out US policies, and it's a launching pad, and it also has a very stable, political system. So they can rely, unlike some of the other countries, that can rely on Australian political stability. And the other aspect to it too is, there's a whole lot of aspects to it. The other aspect is that the Whitlam government was removed by the CIA, essentially by the Americans. In 2010, Kevin Rudd, who was then the Labor government, had announced that he is considering, or the Labor government is considering, bringing in the 40% super profits tax, which would basically, and it'd be on mining industries, which would basically particularly attack or particularly target the big corporations, mining corporations like Rio Tinto, like BHP, which are American companies. Rudd was removed. There was a challenge. Julia Gillard challenged Rudd and took over as the Prime Minister. Rudd was moved. And there is a view that this was largely manoeuvred particularly by the US and the powers that be. So there is that is history of the immense power or the importance of the US and the immense power the US is exercising over Australia. And why not take pride in sovereignty? We agree, totally agree. And in fact, before Whitlam was deposed, there was a real blossoming of Australian culture, and it was working people's culture, and it was an anti-war culture. And then when Whitlam was deposed, that kind of petered away. So I guess what I'm saying is that they're all expressions of the level of the handle that, the tight control that particularly the US and Britain have over Australia, that we need to break through.
I'd like to add to what Shirley said there, and to indicate the sort of control that America has over Australia. Look at it economically, and Shirley's just mentioned some of it there, but was Clinton Fernandez, in his book, Island off the coast of Asia. That's another book of his. It's well worth reading. He did some analysis. Of the 20 largest corporations in Australia, 15, I think the latest was 16, are majority American owned. And now that includes the 4 major banks, Commonwealth, ANZ, National and Westpac, are all majority American owned. That's the banking system. And so you go through it, BHP Billiton, 73% American owned, and Concept Rio Tinto and so on. There's a very strong control economically through those corporations. And then the defence corporations like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and so on that get the defence contracts. I wanted to say something, Laurie, about what can we do together. That petition idea of a Pacific petition, Australia, New Zealand, and Tonga and Fiji and so on, Solomons, a petition idea for a nuclear-free Pacific and keeping foreign bases out or getting rid of them. That's a great idea, and that one we have now, the Talisman Sabre one, could be extended to become a regional petition. I like your idea. I don't know whether you're aware of the Pacific Peace Network, which IPAN helped to set up. That is already a network of a number of activists in countries around the Pacific, Guam, South Korea, Okinawa, and we've got some, I think there's some people from New Zealand, maybe another peace group in New Zealand. Liz, I think someone is involved with it.
Liz
that's Liz Wemmersfeld and World Beyond War.
Yeah, she's in it, and they've had a number of, well, was one action about RIMPAC, a petition about RIMPAC and opposing RIMPAC, and that network could be given more support and better developed, with more people from New Zealand and Australia and the islands involved. And at the moment, there's a speaking tour starting at the end of the week of a woman from Guam, another woman from Okinawa, visiting Australia and talking about militarisation in their countries, and that's part of the Pacific Peace Network. But I'm all for, as you say, seeing areas we can work together, and that we're stronger when we work together. Shirley said enough about the other aspects, but the Americans have a strong control economically and militarily through the Defence Department. They even have on committees, in our Defence Department committees, there are ex-American admirals and so on. They're pointing the way and telling what we should do. It's very deep. We have a big problem to overthrow that, and there's strong feeling developing about that. We're not subservient people, and it's just that we have a leadership in both major parties, and the Labor Party one is fear of another Whitlam whipping if they step out of line.
That's true. I was interested, Bevan, that you talked about the ownership of the banks, because here in New Zealand, they're routinely referred to as the 4 big Australian banks owning the New Zealand banking system, and they have done since the 80s and 90s. And there's constant talk about it. In fact, I'm in my other capacity campaigning against foreign control of Aotearoa. The cover story of our next newsletter is all about the Aussie banks shipping money out of the country. I mean, another historical point of difference between Australia and New Zealand, Henry Kissinger, who's still alive, by the way, at 100 years old, he once described New Zealand as, quote unquote, being a dagger aimed at the heart of Antarctica. In other words, sneering at our complete lack of strategic importance to the Americans at the time of the nuclear-free thing. So there is a difference between the way they see Australia. I saw a cartoon the other day depicting Australia as an aircraft carrier, how Australia will operate under AUKUS as a sort of big unsinkable aircraft carrier. They don't see New Zealand like that. I'm mindful of the fact that our participants are dropping and we've gone past 8 o'clock or 6 o'clock for you guys. So unless people want more discussion, we'll wrap it up. The only other thing I wanted to say was that one of the problems here is within New Zealand, this is for the New Zealand participants, is that we are not communicating with each other. So I learned from yesterday's Christchurch Press mainstream paper under a headline saying football diplomacy draws out big names, with a photograph of Anthony Blinken playing football with schoolgirls in Wellington. And it says AUKUS, a progressive foreign policy group that has been organising public meetings about AUKUS and protested Biden's visit this week, issued a statement last night claiming that, quote, joining AUKUS means agreeing in principle to a war with China, unquote. I've never heard of this group. Anybody on this webinar ever heard of this group? Anybody heard of a group called AUKUS that's organising protests and public meetings about AUKUS? No, I think it's a Wellington thing. I was recently sent by a friend of myself and Warren Thompson here, a man called Mark Roach, sent me a photograph of a protest against AUKUS.
Yes,
I sent to Bevan outside the Labour Party conference, presumably in Wellington.
Yep.
And there was people holding up banners saying, New Zealand, stay out of AUKUS. We don't want a war with China. And I knew nothing about that. And the accompanying email said, did I know that Paul Keating was coming to New Zealand to talk about AUKUS? And no, I didn't know that. And I've heard nothing about it. So I've never heard of this group. I learned this from the Saturday newspaper that used to be owned by Rupert Murdoch and the Fairfaxes until recently. And I've never heard of public meetings and protests against AUKUS. I've no idea where they're being held. I think Wellington. I think it's a Wellington thing.
There's a comment in the chat, Murray, that it's believed to be the former NZ alternative.
Okay, right.
Great.
That's from Jeremy. Okay, well, we'll have to work on that. But so unless anyone's got anything else they want to say, we'll wrap it up. But thank you very much to Bevan and Shirley for taking the time to talk to a small number of New Zealanders. But that's the way these things start. And I mean, I can only think back to like the 80s, like Laurie was saying, we used to work together a lot more. It was all done in those days by physical visits. I went over Australia several times, and you know, good old-fashioned letters and things. It's ironic that in this digital age, etc., there's possibly less communication between our two movements and our two countries. We need to fix that. But I mean, congratulations to IPAN. You've got a big battle against AUKUS, and we're right with you. And if we can help in any way we can, don't ask for thousands of dollars if you don't have it. But I mean, if we can do anything we can to raise the issue, and I suppose from our point of view, work on keeping New Zealand out of the bloody thing.
Absolutely.
Sold a pup. And keeping
Absolutely.
New Zealand out of getting sucked more by things like NATO, etc., back into the sort of American war machine. So we have the same sort of issues, just different expressions of them. And you're dealing with something on a much bigger scale. All right.
Murray, I would like to close the meeting with karakia, if that is
There you go.
okay.
Yep.
Kia so again, just reiterating Murray's thanks to everyone, and thanks to the time and effort that the panelists put in. That was really appreciated. And there was actually a request that came through that if Bevan and Shirley if you have notes from your talks, if you could send them through to Murray. There was just one person who was interested. We might be able to distribute that out amongst the participants. That would be fantastic. But once again, thank you everyone, and I will close us with karakia. Tu tawa mai I runga, tu tawa mai I raro, tu tawa mai I roto, tu tawa mai I waho. Kia tau ai, te mauri tu, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, haumie, huie, taiakie. Come forth from above, below, within and from the environment, vitality and well-being for all, strengthened in unity. So in the spirit of our two countries working together. Kia ora.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you very much.
Murray, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shirley and Bevan, and thank you everybody else for taking part.
Thank you.
See you all.
you.
Okay. Bye.
Nice one, folks.